Let me begin by dismantling something. When most people imagine a healed empath, they picture someone who has simply learned to feel less, someone who has built enough walls, established enough distance, developed enough emotional armor that the world no longer gets in quite so easily. And on the surface, that can look like healing. The crying has stopped, the exhaustion has lifted, the chaos of other people's lives no longer seems to follow them home. So we look at that picture and we call it recovery, but that is not what healing actually produces. And if we mistake numbness for wholeness, if we confuse emotional withdrawal for emotional health, we will spend years building a prison and calling it a sanctuary. Here is what the research, and more importantly, what genuine human experience tells us. The empath, and I use that word not as a mystical designation, but as a psychological description of someone with a highly sensitized nervous system, someone whose mirror neurons fire with unusual intensity, someone who, from a very early age, learned to read the emotional environment with extraordinary precision. This person does not heal by feeling less. They heal by learning to feel differently. And the distinction is everything. Daniel Siegel, the interpersonal neurobiologist whose work on the developing mind has reshaped how we understand human connection, speaks about something he calls the window of tolerance, that optimal zone of nervous system activation where we are present enough to feel, but regulated enough to think. Most unhealed empaths live outside that window. They are either flooded, overwhelmed by emotional input they cannot process, or they are shut down, dissociated, protected behind a wall of numbness that keeps the pain out, but also keeps everything else out too. Neither of these is living. Both of them are survival. What changes in genuine healing is the capacity to stand at the window without falling through it. Daniel Goleman speaks about this with a precision that I find almost impossible to improve upon. He describes how many highly sensitive people, particularly those who grew up in environments where emotional attunement was required for safety, developed empathy not as a natural flowering of human connection, but as a survival strategy. They learned to feel other people's emotions because knowing what someone was feeling, anticipating the shift in a parent's mood, reading the tension in a room before it became dangerous, that knowledge was protection. Empathy, in other words, was not a gift they were given. It was an adaptation they were forced to make. And adaptations, however brilliant, carry a cost. The cost here was the loss of a boundary between self and other. The loss of the ability to say, this feeling is mine, and that feeling belongs to you, and I can honor yours without being consumed by it. So the unhealed empath does not simply feel with people. They feel as people. They dissolve into the emotional experience of whoever is in front of them, losing themselves completely, and then wonder why they are always so exhausted, always so depleted, always so confused about what they actually want. The healed empath does something radical by comparison. They remain present, they remain open, but they watch, they witness, they allow themselves to be moved by another person's experience without being swept away by it. There is a self that stays standing, a center that holds, an observer who can feel the weight of someone else's pain and still know clearly and without confusion that it is not their pain to carry. This is not detachment. This is not indifference dressed in spiritual language. This is the difference between a candle that lights the room and a candle that burns the house down. The healed empath finally learns how to give light without consuming themselves in the process. Now, once you understand that shift, once you grasp what it means to witness rather than absorb, to remain present without dissolving, something else begins to make sense. Something that surprises people when they first encounter it. The healed empath does not become easier to deceive. They become, in fact, almost impossible to manipulate. And this confounds people because the common assumption, the one quietly embedded in how we talk about sensitivity, about openness, about emotional depth, is that feeling deeply makes you vulnerable. That the more you care, the more exposed you are. That empathy, by its very nature, is a door that anyone with enough skill can walk through. We have all heard some version of this. Be careful, you are too trusting. You feel too much. Your heart is too open. As though the solution to being hurt is to feel less, care less, become less. But that assumption contains a fundamental misunderstanding of what empathy actually is and what it becomes in a person who has done genuine psychological work. Think about it this way. The unhealed empath is manipulable, not because they feel too much, but because they have not yet learned to direct that feeling inward with the same intensity they direct it outward. They can read a room with extraordinary accuracy. They can sense the shift in someone's energy before a word is spoken. They can feel the weight of an unspoken grief from across a dinner table. But ask them what they themselves are feeling, what they need, what they want, what their own body is telling them in this moment. And often there is a long, uncomfortable silence because they were never taught to turn that extraordinary perceptual apparatus on themselves. And this is precisely the gap that manipulation enters through. Robert Cialdini's foundational work on influence identified several key mechanisms through which people are moved against their own interests: reciprocity, commitment, scarcity, and perhaps most relevant here, liking and pity. The narcissist, the manipulator, the person with exploitative relational patterns, instinctively weaponizes these mechanisms. They perform vulnerability to trigger the empath's caregiving instinct. They manufacture urgency to override the empath's capacity for reflection. They deploy guilt with surgical precision, targeting the empath's deep-seated fear that they are not doing enough, not giving enough, not being enough. And here is the devastating irony. The very sensitivity that allows the empath to feel someone else's pain so acutely, that same sensitivity, when it is not anchored in self-knowledge, becomes the instrument of their own undoing. They feel the manipulators perform distress as though it were real, because to their nervous system, it registers as real. They cannot yet distinguish between genuine suffering and strategic suffering, between someone who is drowning and someone who has learned that pretending to drown gets them exactly what they want. What healing does, and this is where it becomes genuinely profound, is it turns the light around. The empath who has done the work of self-understanding, who has sat with their own patterns, their own wounds, their own triggers, develops something that can only be described as emotional forensics. They still feel everything, but now they also think about what they feel. They notice the sensation and then ask, is this mine? Is this true? Does this person's distress match their behavior? Does the story they are telling align with what my body already knows? Gabor Mate speaks about the body as an intelligence system that often knows the truth long before the mind is willing to accept it. The healed empath has learned to listen to that system, to trust the quiet alarm that sounds when something does not add up, rather than silencing it in the name of compassion. And what emerges from that integration, that marriage of deep feeling and clear thinking, is not a person who has closed themselves off from the world. It is a person who finally understands that true compassion requires discernment, and that the most empathic thing you can do for yourself is to stop extending empathy to people who are using it as a weapon against you. There is a confession that comes up again and again in the stories of people who have lived inside narcissistic or emotionally exploitative relationships. And it is not the confession you might expect. It is not, I did not see the warning signs. It is not, I did not know what was happening. More often, with a kind of quiet devastation, people say, I saw it. I felt it early. Something in me knew, and I stayed anyway. Not because they were foolish, not because they were broken beyond recognition, but because something in their relational wiring had taught them long before this particular relationship began that love and difficulty were the same thing, that care meant solving someone, that intimacy was earned through endurance. This is the pattern we need to examine now, because everything we have built so far, the witnessing, the discernment, the emotional forensics, all of it leads here to the question of how the healed empath actually chooses who gets to be in their life. John Bowlby, whose attachment theory remains one of the most important frameworks in modern psychology, argued that the patterns we develop in our earliest relationships become what he called internal working models, essentially emotional blueprints shape how we interpret love, how we respond to intimacy, and critically, what we have come to expect from the people we allow close to us. For many empaths, those early blueprints were written in environments of inconsistency, of love that was conditional, unpredictable, or entangled with emotional labor, where affection had to be won, maintained, constantly re-earned. And so the nervous system learned to read volatility as passion, inconsistency as depth, the push and pull of an unstable relationship as evidence that something real and significant was happening. Stability, by contrast, felt unfamiliar. Sometimes it even felt boring, not because these people did not deserve peace, but because peace had never been part of their relational vocabulary. This is why the unhealed empath does not simply fall into difficult relationships by accident. They are drawn to them by something far more deeply embedded than poor judgment. They are following a map, an old, outdated, inherited map that tells them this feeling of anxiety, this urgency, this need to prove your worth and earn your place. This is what love feels like. And anything that does not produce that feeling cannot possibly be the real thing. The healed empath has done something extraordinarily difficult. They have looked at that map, recognized it for what it is, not a truth about love, but a record of early injury, and they have chosen to draw a new one. And this changes everything about how they enter relationships. They stop auditioning, stop arriving with their resume of emotional availability, their willingness to give more than they receive, their quiet readiness to make themselves smaller so that someone else can feel larger. They stop being impressed by intensity alone, by grand gestures that contradict daily behavior, by someone's potential, their hidden depth, the person they could become if only given enough patience and love and time. Gabor Mate reminds us that we are not responsible for the wounds we received in childhood, but we are responsible for recognizing how those wounds drive our adult choices. And the healed empath takes that responsibility seriously. They do not enter a relationship asking, can I fix this person? They ask something far more revealing. They ask, is this person already doing the work? Not perfectly, not without struggle, but genuinely, demonstrably, with the kind of self-awareness that cannot be faked over time. They choose presence over promise, consistency over chemistry, reality over potential, because the healed empath has finally understood that they are not a rehabilitation center. They are a human being who deserves a partner, not a project. There is something that happens in long-term exposure to narcissistic or emotionally exploitative dynamics that does not get discussed nearly enough. And it is not the obvious damage, the anxiety, the self-doubt, the hypervigilance that follows you into every subsequent relationship. Those are visible. Those get named. Those eventually find their way into therapy rooms and support groups and the kind of late night conversations people have when they finally feel safe enough to tell the truth. What does not get discussed nearly enough is what happens to the self, not the confidence, not the mood, the self, that internal architecture of values, preferences, instincts, and orientations that makes you distinctly, irreducibly you. Because one of the most sophisticated and devastating features of sustained narcissistic dynamics is not that they attack you, it is that they replace you slowly, incrementally, so gradually that you do not notice it happening. Your preferences begin to defer to theirs. Your instincts begin to require their validation before you trust them. Your sense of what is reason, what is acceptable, what you deserve, all of it quietly recalibrates around their reality rather than your own. And one day you'll look up and realize you cannot answer a simple question, not a philosophical question, not an abstract question, something as basic as, what do you enjoy? What do you actually want? Who are you when nobody needs anything from you? The silence that greets those questions is one of the loneliest sounds in human experience. Erik Erikson, whose work on identity development across the lifespan gave us a framework for understanding how selfhood is constructed and reconstructed across time, argued that identity is never simply given. It is achieved. It is built through a process of exploration and commitment, of trying things, encountering the world, and gradually discovering what is genuinely yours versus what was handed to you by your environment. But what happens when your environment was systematically hostile to that exploration? What happens when every reaching outward, every assertion of preference, every quiet declaration of selfhood was met with ridicule, dismissal, or punishment? You stop reaching. You learn to exist in the shape that causes the least disruption. You become, in the most literal psychological sense, a self organized around someone else's comfort rather than your own truth. This is what the healed empath must excavate. And excavation is the right word, because the self was not destroyed. It was buried under years of accommodation, of shrinking, of translating their own needs into a language palatable enough that someone deeply uncomfortable with other people's needs might tolerate hearing it. Healing, then, is not reinvention. It is archaeology. It is the patient, courageous process of brushing away the accumulated sediment of other people's projections, other people's definitions, other people's versions of who you are and what you deserve, until something true and original begins to emerge, until you can sit with yourself in silence and feel not emptiness or anxiety, but the quiet, unmistakable presence of someone you recognize. Gabor Mate speaks about authenticity as the immune system of the soul, the force that, when operating properly, knows the difference between what genuinely belongs to you and what was grafted onto you by circumstance and survival. And when the healed empath reconnects with that authenticity, something remarkable becomes visible. They develop opinions that do not shift based on the room they are in. They develop preferences they do not apologize for. They develop the capacity to disappoint people and survive it, to be misunderstood and not crumble, to stand in the fullness of who they are without requiring anyone's permission to do so. This is not arrogance. It is not rigidity. It is the simple revolutionary act of occupying yourself completely, because the most radical thing a person who is taught to disappear can do is to finally, unapologetically take up the space they were always meant to fill. At some point in almost every empath's healing journey, there is a moment of unexpected grief. Not grief over the relationships that wounded them, that grief comes earlier, and it is necessary, and most people recognize it when it arrives. This is a different kind of grief, quieter, more disorienting. It is the grief that surfaces when they begin to realize how long they spent apologizing for the very thing that makes them most extraordinary, because the world has not been kind to sensitivity. We live inside cultures that have, for generations, organized themselves around a very particular hierarchy of human qualities: productivity over presence, logic over tenderness, toughness over tenderness. And somewhere inside that hierarchy, the message was delivered, sometimes loudly, sometimes in the accumulated silence of 1,000 small dismissals, that feeling deeply was a liability, that noticing everything was exhausting to others, that your sensitivity was, at best, something to be managed, and at worst, something to be ashamed of. And so many empaths arrived at adulthood carrying their sensitivity like a wound rather than a weapon, hiding it, minimizing it, performing a toughness they did not feel because the alternative, being seen as too much, too emotional, too affected by a world that seemed to move through everyone else without leaving a mark, felt unbearable. What healing does is reverse that entire orientation. Antonio Damasio, the neuroscientist whose landmark research on emotion and decision-making fundamentally challenged the Cartesian separation of feeling and thought, demonstrated something that should have changed everything about how we value emotional intelligence. His work showed that patients with damage to the emotional processing centers of the brain, people who could still reason perfectly, whose IQ remained intact, whose logical faculties were entirely undisturbed, became catastrophically bad at making decisions, not because they thought less clearly, but because they felt nothing. Because emotion, it turns out, is not the enemy of good judgment. It is one of its primary instruments. The empath, then, is not someone burdened with too much feeling. They are someone equipped with an extraordinarily sophisticated decision-making apparatus that most people never fully develop. The problem was never the sensitivity itself. The problem was the absence of the self-knowledge and the psychological grounding required to use it with precision. Think about what a fully integrated, sensitive person can actually do. They can walk into a negotiation and read the unspoken dynamics in the room before a single word of substance has been exchanged. They can hear what is not being said in a conversation, the hesitation beneath the confidence, the fear beneath the anger, the longing beneath the indifference. They can sense when a situation is shifting before the shift becomes visible to anyone else. They can hold complexity, emotional, relational, moral complexity, without collapsing it into something simpler and more manageable, the way people who are uncomfortable with ambiguity invariably do. These are not soft skills. These are among the most sophisticated cognitive and interpersonal capabilities a human being can possess. And the healed empath does not just retain these capacities, they sharpen them, because now they are no longer distorted by the static of unprocessed trauma, by the desperation of unmet needs, by the confusion of a self that has not yet been fully claimed. Gabor Mate speaks about how our wounds and our gifts are almost always located in the same place. The sensitivity that made you a target also makes you a healer. The depth that made you easy to manipulate also makes you impossible to fool once you know yourself. The intensity that exhausted the wrong people is the very thing that will sustain the right ones. Your sensitivity was never the problem. It was always the point. And the healed empath does not feel less than the world around them. They finally understand that they were built to feel what the rest of the world is still learning to see. There is a question I want you to sit with for a moment before we go further. Think about the last time you did something genuinely kind for someone, not because you were asked, not because you were obligated, not because the alternative was conflict or withdrawal or that familiar low hum of guilt that follows you when you dare to say no. Think about a moment when you helped someone, comforted some, and some, gave something of yourself to someone, and it cost you nothing. Not because it was insignificant, but because it came from a place so full, so unforced, so freely available, that the giving itself felt like a form of receiving. Now think about how rare that felt. Because for most unhealed empaths, that experience empathy as genuine abundance rather than anxious obligation is the exception rather than the rule. Most of what gets performed as empathy in the early stages of this kind of life is not really empathy at all. It is appeasement. It is the management of other people's emotional states in order to regulate your own. It is the compulsive, exhausting, deeply unconscious work of keeping everyone comfortable so that the environment remains safe, so that the threat of abandonment or anger or disappointment stays at a manageable distance. This is what trauma-organized empathy looks like, and it looks so much like genuine care from the outside and even from the inside that most people never examine the difference. Stephen Porges, whose polyvagal theory has revolutionized how we understand the autonomic nervous system and human social connection, describes the state of genuine care and connection as one that is only possible when the nervous system feels fundamentally safe, when the body is not in a state of chronic threat assessment, when the social engagement system, that elegant neurological architecture that allows us to truly see and be seen by another person, is operating freely without the interference of survival circuitry running in the background. What this means in plain language is that you cannot genuinely give from a place of fear. You can perform giving. You can execute the behaviors associated with generosity and care with remarkable precision, but the quality of presence that true empathy requires, the full, undivided, unhurried adaptation of one human being to another, is simply not available to a nervous system that is simultaneously managing its own unprocessed alarm. The healed empath discovers this not as a theory, but as a lived experience. There is a moment, and people who have crossed this threshold describe it with a kind of quiet wonder, when they realize that they helped someone today and they did not feel depleted afterward, that they held space for someone's grief without it becoming their grief, that they gave their time, their attention, their genuine care, and something in them felt not emptier, but more itself, more alive, more connected to the original impulse toward human warmth that was always there beneath the anxiety and the obligation and the fear. This is empathy as choice, empathy as expression of values rather than execution of survival strategy. And the difference between those two things is not subtle. It is the difference between a life spent running on empty and a life that generates its own energy from the simple, profound act of being genuinely present with another human being. Gabor Mate speaks about compassion as something that must begin with the self, that the capacity to truly meet another person in their suffering requires first that you have sat honestly with your own. You cannot give what you have not yet found. You cannot offer presence to another while you are still absent from yourself. And when the healed empath finally arrives at that presence, fully honestly, without the old machinery of obligation grinding beneath every act of care, they discover that empathy was never the burden they were taught to endure. It was always the gift they were born to give, and healing was simply the long journey back to giving it freely.